The oppressive heat of early June in the year 1900 settled over Beijing like a suffocating burial shroud. Within the ancient, towering walls of the Tartar city, the stagnant air mirrored the dangerously volatile political climate, slowly strangling the Chinese capital. A fanatic and violent insurgency, known to the Western world as the Boxers, was ruthlessly sweeping inward from the drought-stricken countryside. These mystical warriors, bound by bloody oaths and deep hatred, believed themselves entirely invulnerable to foreign bullets as they marched toward the fragile enclaves of the imperial capital. Amidst this gathering storm stood George Ernest Morrison, a ruggedly pragmatic Australian physician and the highly respected resident correspondent for the Times. Unlike the remarkably complacent European diplomats sipping imported tea in their manicured gardens, Morrison possessed a keen tactical mind honed by harsh outback survival. He observed the terrified influx of Chinese Christian refugees with growing alarm, understanding immediately that the isolated incidents of rural violence were coalescing into an organized, catastrophic siege. Morrison quietly checked his revolver, knowing the diplomatic illusions of safety would soon shatter into unimaginable bloodshed. The international legation quarter existed as an arrogant, fragile bubble of foreign privilege, situated dangerously close to the Forbidden City. Wealthy ministers and their families continued their evening banquets and string quartets, willfully blind to the gathering darkness outside their guarded gates. They haughtily dismissed the Boxer threat as merely an undisciplined peasant uprising that the Imperial Qing army would easily suppress. Morrison angrily confronted the British minister, Sir Claude MacDonald, stating clearly that the entire quarter was practically defenseless. "They are blinding themselves to an imminent massacre," Morrison noted furiously. The horrifying realization of their complete isolation struck the legation quarter when all telegraph lines connecting Beijing to the outside coastal cities were deliberately severed. This was the first chilling hook of reality that silenced the arrogant diplomatic community, leaving them totally blind and deaf to the world. No messages for military assistance could be transmitted, and no news of relief forces could reach the terrified foreign civilians. The severed wires hanging from wooden poles outside the city walls signaled clearly that the trap had been masterfully and completely shut. Refusing to succumb to the growing panic, the resilient Australian journalist conducted his own incredibly dangerous reconnaissance missions beyond the immediate diplomatic boundaries. Disguised and moving swiftly through the shadowed alleyways, Morrison witnessed Imperial Qing soldiers actively fraternizing with the red-sashed Boxer rebels. The grim discovery confirmed his darkest suspicions that Empress Dowager Cixi was secretly endorsing the systematic extermination of all foreigners within her domain. Every narrow street smelled faintly of smoke and spilled blood, serving as a terrifying preview of the apocalyptic violence about to descend upon them. The definitive shattering of the diplomatic illusion occurred on the bloody morning of June 20th with a shocking assassination that paralyzed the international community. The imposing German envoy, Baron Clemens von Kettler, was brutally gunned down by a uniformed Imperial Manchu captain while traveling via sedan chair to the Zhongli Yamen. This brazen, cold-blooded murder of a high-ranking foreign minister in broad daylight eliminated any remaining hope for a peaceful political resolution. The chaotic news triggered a massive, terrified stampede of foreign civilians desperately seeking shelter behind any defensible stone wall. Complete pandemonium erupted across the once serene diplomatic streets as hundreds of terrified missionaries, diplomats, and Chinese Christians abandoned their undefended homes. Recognizing the strategic necessity of a centralized defense, Morrison vigorously assisted in desperately funneling the panicked civilian population directly into the sprawling British legation. This compound offered the strongest masonry walls and the most defensible geographical perimeter against the encroaching enemy forces. Belongings were tragically discarded in the dusty streets as men, women, and crying children raced frantically against the terrifyingly swift advance of the screaming Boxer vanguard. As the heavily reinforced wooden gates of the British legation were finally slammed shut and barricaded, a chilling discovery was made by the rear guard. A freshly severed head, dripping dark crimson blood onto the cobblestones, had been deliberately left directly outside the primary entrance as a gruesome warning. This bloody message clearly communicated the absolute ruthlessness of the thousands of fanatic warriors now completely encircling the hastily fortified diplomatic compound. There would be absolutely no quarter given, no mercy shown, and definitely no prisoners taken during the impending massacre. Inside the overcrowded and chaotic British legation, Morrison immediately transitioned from a civilian observer into an active, indispensable frontline tactical defender. Drawing upon his rugged Australian frontier experience, he tirelessly organized bewildered civilian volunteers into efficient labor crews to construct emergency defensive fortifications. Sandbags were rapidly filled with dirt dug from the immaculate diplomatic lawns, while expensive silk curtains and priceless antique furniture were ruthlessly piled high to reinforce vulnerable windows. Morrison barked orders with a calm, authoritative intensity, forcing the terrified aristocratic refugees to face the grim reality of survival. The combined military strength defending the entire besieged compound consisted of merely 400 lightly armed multinational Marines and sailors. This severely outgunned force, representing 8 different nations, struggled initially with chaotic language barriers and deeply ingrained, conflicting military command structures. However, the looming specter of a brutal death rapidly forced these diverse soldiers to forge an unbreakable, desperate tactical alliance. Morrison frequently patrolled the newly established defensive perimeter, offering tactical advice and grim encouragement to the exhausted young sentries gripping their loaded rifles with sweaty, trembling hands. As the first agonizingly tense night of the siege finally fell, a profound, suffocating darkness enveloped the terrified occupants of the British legation. The oppressive summer heat offered no relief, and the sudden, terrifying silence immediately following the chaotic daytime retreat was thick with unspoken dread. Suddenly, the distant, rhythmic, and deeply unsettling sound of thousands of voices chanting war cries began echoing ominously from just beyond the Tartar wall. Shah, Shah, the terrifying Mandarin command to kill, floated over the barricades, chilling the blood of every listening defender. The psychological warfare waged by the surrounding Boxer forces was incredibly effective, utilizing relentless noise to systematically shatter the defenders' fragile nerves. Piercing horns, clashing cymbals, and explosive firecrackers created a deafening, demonic cacophony intended to simulate a massive, overwhelming nighttime infantry assault. Morrison stood vigil on a hastily constructed firing step, his eyes straining desperately to penetrate the heavy gloom illuminated only by distant, burning churches. He sternly warned the inexperienced civilian guards beside him to conserve their precious ammunition and absolutely never fire blindly into the terrifying darkness. The stark realization that they were completely trapped in a hostile city of millions began to crush the morale of the softer diplomatic officials. The previously arrogant ministers now huddled nervously in the crowded, humid cellars, heavily reliant on the rugged determination of men like the Australian journalist. Morrison's sheer physical presence and unwavering confidence became a vital anchor of sanity for the terrified community trapped within the increasingly battered brick walls. He meticulously recorded every grim detail in his journal, determined to document their desperate struggle for survival. As dawn finally broke over the beleaguered compound, the terrifying reality of their desperate strategic situation became horribly illuminated by the morning sun. Thick columns of black smoke rose menacingly from every direction, indicating that the remaining foreign properties across Beijing were being systematically looted and burned. The British legation now stood as a solitary, fragile island of desperate defiance violently marooned within a vast, turbulent ocean of unbridled hatred. Morrison checked his ammunition supply with grim finality, knowing the initial skirmishes were merely a prelude to utter hell. The initial Boxer assaults against the outer perimeter were poorly organized but executed with an absolutely terrifying, fanatical disregard for human life. Waves of screaming attackers, armed predominantly with rusty swords and primitive spears, rushed the foreign barricades with terrifying speed and blind religious zeal. The disciplined volley fire from the multinational Marines cut down the front ranks, yet the attackers continuously pressed forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Morrison calmly fired his revolver into the charging mass, his face a hardened mask of grim, calculated survival. Amidst the deafening roar of relentless gunfire, the remarkable courage of the civilian defenders was severely tested and surprisingly proven on the barricades. Driven by the terrifying knowledge of what awaited their families if the perimeter fell, ordinary clerks and scholars fought with absolute savage desperation. Morrison moved continuously along the most dangerously exposed sections of the defensive line, physically pulling wounded men to safety while simultaneously directing suppressing fire. His natural leadership in the face of imminent death cemented his legendary status among the desperate, trapped legation defenders. The introduction of modern artillery by the regular Imperial Qing army significantly escalated the sheer destructive lethality of the ongoing siege. Heavy shells began raining down upon the British legation, easily shattering stone chimneys and instantly obliterating the fragile roofs of the civilian shelters. The terrifying shriek of incoming artillery rounds forced everyone into muddy trenches, completely destroying any lingering illusions that the Chinese government might intervene to save them. Morrison grimly watched a nearby wall collapse into a cloud of choking dust, realizing their defenses were fundamentally inadequate. As the unrelenting bombardment continued throughout the sweltering afternoon, the critical issue of severe water shortages immediately became a massive tactical nightmare. With hundreds of terrified refugees desperately demanding hydration in the suffocating heat, the few functioning wells within the compound were dangerously overdrawn. Morrison pragmatically organized strict rationing protocols, brutally enforcing the unpopular rules to ensure the fighting men remained sufficiently hydrated to continue defending the walls. "Every drop spilled is a minute closer to our absolute slaughter," he loudly reminded a complaining European diplomat hiding in the cellar. The relentless psychological strain of the continuous, deafening bombardment began to fracture the fragile mental stability of several trapped civilian refugees. Uncontrollable weeping and sudden, panicked screams occasionally erupted from the darkened cellars, threatening to spread a highly contagious, disastrous wave of complete hysteria. Morrison actively countered this internal threat by deliberately assigning meaningless but physically exhausting labor tasks to the most dangerously panicked individuals. Keeping their trembling hands occupied with filling heavy sandbags effectively distracted their terrified minds from the impending doom echoing just outside the shattered gates. As the blood-soaked sun finally set on the absolute carnage of the very first day, the true, horrifying scale of their predicament settled in. The initial, chaotic adrenaline rush faded into a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion that permeated every single defender slumping against the battered, bullet-scarred barricades. Morrison stood quietly covered in gray masonry dust and dried blood, staring intensely toward the terrifyingly dark, hostile labyrinth of the ancient Tartar city. The 55-day descent into absolute hell had officially begun, and the hardened Australian journalist remained resolutely prepared to fight. The absolute isolation of the besieged legation was profoundly magnified by the complete absence of any reliable tactical intelligence from the outside world. Rumors violently circulated among the exhausted defenders like a terrible sickness, whispering of massive relief columns either swiftly approaching or being entirely annihilated. Morrison recognized the incredible danger of false hope and stubbornly urged the civilian leadership to prepare exclusively for a protracted, agonizingly brutal starvation siege. He firmly believed that expecting any immediate foreign military salvation would only dangerously soften their required razor-sharp edge of survival. Staring into the suffocating smoke-filled night, Morrison checked the rotating cylinder of his heavy revolver one final, meticulous time before attempting to rest. The menacing glow of burning European structures illuminated the distant horizon, casting long, demonic shadows across the blood-stained courtyards of the British compound. The Australian journalist knew intimately that tomorrow would inevitably bring significantly heavier artillery bombardments and even more fanatical, suicidal charges against their fragile walls. He simply tightened his leather belt, closed his exhausted eyes momentarily, and silently embraced the brutal reality of the unfolding nightmare. The hastily fortified perimeter of the British legation now served as the absolute boundary between fragile civilization and utter savagery. Late June brought an incredibly oppressive, sweltering heat that mercilessly baked the defensive trenches. George Ernest Morrison transitioned entirely from a sharp-eyed journalistic observer into a grim, indispensable frontline combatant coordinating the terrified defenders. He wiped grimy sweat from his brow, gripping his rifle tightly as the relentless sniper fire from the towering Tartar wall chipped dangerously at the fragile masonry directly above his exhausted head. Inside the dangerously overcrowded compound, thousands of terrified civilian refugees huddled miserably beneath whatever meager shelter they could hastily construct from shattered debris. The defense relied entirely upon a chaotic, deeply fractured coalition of multinational Marines and desperate civilian volunteers. Morrison recognized immediately that the severe lack of unified military command was almost as deadly as the fanatical boxers surrounding their sanctuary. He continually navigated the tense, culturally divided barricades, using his rugged Australian pragmatism to forcefully bridge deadly communication gaps between the stubborn international troops. The horrifying tactical evolution of the besieging forces became undeniably apparent when a massive, deliberately set fire roared to life just beyond the perimeter. The Boxers intentionally ignited the adjacent Hanlon Academy, an ancient library of priceless literature, simply to let the inferno spread directly into the legation. The ferocious, crackling flames painted the night sky an apocalyptic crimson, violently threatening to completely consume the desperate defenders. Morrison desperately rallied exhausted bucket brigades, screaming frantic orders over the deafening roar of the encroaching blaze to save their sanctuary. The intense, blistering heat radiating from the burning Hanlon Academy physically scorched the faces of the struggling legation defenders as they desperately fought the flames. Sparks rained down like agonizing hellfire upon the fragile roofs of the diplomatic buildings, igniting small, terrifying fires that demanded immediate attention. Morrison personally led a heavily armed sortie directly into the burning ruins, aggressively pushing back the opportunistic Boxer arsonists. "Keep the water moving, or we all burn tonight," he roared at a terrified line of exhausted Italian sailors, passing heavy buckets. By the bleak, soot-stained light of the following dawn, the immediate catastrophic threat of the roaring fire had been narrowly and miraculously averted. However, the smoldering, utterly blackened ruins of the once magnificent academy now provided the Imperial Chinese snipers with significantly closer elevated firing positions. The continuous, terrifying crack of high-velocity Mauser rifles forced the terrified refugees to crawl miserably on their bellies just to survive. Morrison meticulously surveyed the newly compromised defensive lines, grimly realizing their perimeter was steadily shrinking under the crushing, relentless enemy pressure. The incredibly dangerous and highly exposed guard duties along the most vulnerable sectors of the barricades naturally fell to the most hardened, resilient men. The small but fiercely determined contingent of Australians, led effectively by the indomitable Morrison, consistently volunteered to hold the most actively contested positions. They brought a unique, rugged outback toughness to the brutal urban warfare, maintaining an eerie, terrifyingly calm discipline while enduring continuous point-blank fire. Their unyielding presence on the smoking rubble became a vital symbol of absolute defiance for the terrified community. As the brutal siege dragged agonizingly into its second endless week, the critical necessity of securing adequate combat supplies became a desperate obsession. Morrison utilized his extensive knowledge of the local Beijing terrain to organize incredibly risky nighttime scavenging raids into the heavily contested commercial districts. These terrifying, silent excursions into the dark, corpse-strewn alleyways yielded absolutely vital treasures like abandoned grain sacks and heavy timber. Every single successful raid was a terrifying brush with sudden death, but the recovered supplies were essential to keep the starving legation alive. A horrifying, chilling inventory check of the Central Armory abruptly shattered any lingering, fragile optimism held by the desperate multinational military command. The grim, undeniable mathematics of their desperate situation revealed that their rapidly depleting stock of rifle ammunition would completely run out in merely 5 days. This terrifying revelation was strictly classified to prevent an immediate, catastrophic panic among the completely exhausted civilian population sheltering in the cellars. Morrison quietly absorbed this devastating intelligence, his hardened expression never changing as he silently calculated the impending brutal melee. To drastically conserve their dangerously low ammunition reserves, strict, desperately uncompromising new engagement protocols were immediately enforced across the entire crumbling defensive perimeter. Defenders were absolutely forbidden from returning blind fire into the suffocating darkness, ordered instead to wait until they could clearly see their attackers. This terrifying order required an immense, almost superhuman level of psychological discipline as the deafening Boxer war cries continuously echoed from the shadows. Morrison calmly walked the tense line of barricades, steadily reminding the trembling young recruits that fire discipline was their salvation. In a brilliant, desperate stroke of absolute tactical ingenuity, the heavily outgunned defenders miraculously constructed a makeshift artillery piece from scavenged, rusted debris. They mounted an antique, heavily oxidized British cannon barrel onto an abandoned Italian carriage, securing the fragile contraption tightly with thick ropes. Loaded predominantly with Russian ammunition and affectionately dubbed the International Gun, this bizarre weapon provided a surprisingly effective psychological boost. Morrison watched with grim satisfaction as the loud, terrifying roar of the makeshift cannon briefly silenced the relentless chanting of the surrounding Boxer fanatics. The fragile illusion of a stabilized defensive line was violently and catastrophically shattered during a sudden, incredibly bloody midnight breach of the outer barricades. Elite Imperial Qing soldiers, utilizing the terrifying cover of a heavy summer thunderstorm, silently eliminated the forward sentries and swarmed rapidly over the walls. The chaotic, deafening clash of steel bayonets and desperate revolver fire instantly awakened the terrified legation as a brutal melee erupted. Morrison violently thrust himself directly into the terrifying, confusing epicenter of the brutal night combat, firing his heavy weapon completely empty. The desperate, swirling fight within the compromised courtyard quickly degenerated into a terrifying, primitive struggle for sheer, bloody survival in the pouring rain. Flashes of brilliant lightning briefly illuminated the horrifying scenes of desperate men ruthlessly strangling and stabbing each other in the thick mud. Morrison utilized a heavy, splintered wooden club to violently beat back a screaming Imperial soldier who was actively attempting to bayonet a wounded Marine. "Hold the line, do not let them reach the cellar doors," he roared ferociously over the deafening thunder and agonizing screams. Through an incredible, almost superhuman display of sheer, collective desperation, the deeply exhausted defenders miraculously managed to violently push the surviving attackers back outside. The heavy, splintered wooden gates were frantically barricaded once again, sealed tightly with the bloody corpses of the fallen enemy soldiers left behind in the mud. As the heavy rain washed the thick blood from the slippery cobblestones, the surviving defenders slumped down in absolute exhaustion. Morrison, breathing heavily and bleeding from a minor shrapnel laceration, grimly reloaded his revolver in the eerie, sudden silence. The terrifying, close-quarters brutality of the midnight breach inflicted a massive, deeply profound psychological toll on the already severely traumatized civilian population inside. The agonizing, continuous moans of the severely wounded men actively bleeding to death in the makeshift hospital echoed hauntingly through the dark corridors. Sleep became an absolute impossibility as every sudden noise or distant crack of thunder instantly triggered horrifying flashbacks of the brutal melee. Morrison moved quietly among the terrified families, offering gruff reassurances while secretly acknowledging the rapidly deteriorating, desperate reality of their situation. The overwhelming putrid stench of decaying flesh from unburied bodies outside the walls became a constant, intensely sickening companion to the trapped defenders. The sweltering summer heat rapidly accelerated the horrific decomposition, attracting massive swarms of aggressive black flies that mercilessly tormented the wounded and the dying. Morrison strictly ordered the immediate cremation of enemy corpses that fell dangerously close to their fragile barricades to prevent infectious disease. He watched the thick black smoke rise lazily into the hazy sky, adding toxic elements to the already suffocating, highly polluted air. The profound, heartbreaking suffering of the incredibly fragile, innocent children trapped within the heavily bombarded compound was undoubtedly the most devastating aspect of the siege. Deprived of fresh milk, adequate nutrition, and basic sanitation, the youngest refugees rapidly fell victim to severe dysentery and highly contagious fevers. Morrison often surrendered his own meager daily ration of tough pony meat to a starving child, hiding his own agonizing hunger. The tragic, silent burial of infants in the shaded corners of the ruined diplomatic gardens severely tested the remaining defenders' resolve. The heavily armed Imperial troops surrounding the shrinking perimeter continuously demonstrated a highly organized, terrifyingly methodical approach to systematically dismantling the fragile defenses. They aggressively constructed intricate, heavily fortified zigzag trenches that crept agonizingly closer to the British legation with every passing, intensely terrifying night of the siege. This incredibly dangerous tactic completely neutralized the defenders' slight advantage in marksmanship, allowing the enemy to hurl devastating explosives safely. Morrison recognized the severe tactical brilliance of this slow strangulation, deeply frustrated by his inability to counterattack their deeply entrenched positions. Despite the overwhelming, seemingly insurmountable odds stacked against their continued survival, the rugged Australian journalist entirely refused to physically or mentally surrender to despair. He continuously organized aggressive, highly dangerous counter-sniping operations, personally selecting the most accurately skilled marksmen to relentlessly harass the deeply entrenched Imperial artillery crews. His tall, imposing figure, constantly covered in thick gray dust and heavily stained with dried blood, became an absolutely essential fixture. The terrified, desperately exhausted multinational defenders instinctively looked to Morrison for crucial tactical guidance and vital, unwavering psychological strength during combat. The physical exhaustion of constantly remaining absolutely vigilant on the shattered barricades began producing terrifying, incredibly vivid auditory hallucinations among the desperate multinational guards. Young sentries frequently reported hearing entirely non-existent relief trumpets or the phantom sounds of approaching friendly artillery echoing clearly through the dense, oppressive fog. Morrison aggressively combat this dangerous psychological deterioration by forcing mandatory, tightly scheduled sleep rotations, threatening severe physical punishment for any dereliction. He knew that false hope was undeniably the absolute deadliest poison that could completely destroy their fragile, heavily battered defensive perimeter. As the brutal, completely unforgiving month of June finally bled into a seemingly hopeless July, the deeply battered defenders braced themselves for the absolute worst. Their restricted ammunition was almost entirely depleted, their meager food supplies were dangerously low, and their physical endurance was stretched to its breaking point. The terrifying ring of fire surrounding their fragile sanctuary was slowly, inevitably tightening, promising only a highly violent, merciless conclusion. Morrison quietly tightened his grip on his heavy rifle, absolutely determined to make the approaching enemy pay a steep, bloody price. The suffocating month of July descended upon the battered British legation with a terrifying and merciless heat that seemed to actively mock the exhausted defenders. The once elegant diplomatic compound was now a violently claustrophobic and disease-ridden labyrinth of shattered masonry and hastily dug mud trenches. The gruesome and visceral reality of absolute starvation began systematically destroying the physical and mental endurance of every trapped survivor. Morrison noted with a grim and hollowed expression that the previously vibrant children were now practically skeletal, their eyes sunken deeply into incredibly pale, heavily dirt-streaked faces. The agonizingly desperate depletion of standard food reserves inevitably forced the multinational command to authorize an incredibly heartbreaking but absolutely vital dietary shift. The magnificent and highly prized aristocratic polo ponies, once symbols of extreme diplomatic wealth and leisure, were systematically led to the makeshift slaughterhouse. Cooking these beautiful animals provided the desperately needed, albeit incredibly tough and heavily gristly, protein required to keep the frontline soldiers standing. Morrison chewed the intensely stringy, poorly roasted meat in absolute silence, completely ignoring the quiet, devastated weeping of the aristocratic owners standing nearby. The severely compromised sanitation within the heavily overcrowded and violently bombarded compound rapidly birthed a terrifying invisible enemy that proved deadlier than boxer swords. Rampant dysentery violently swept through the highly vulnerable civilian population sheltering in the humid and incredibly filthy cellar compartments. The desperate mothers possessed absolutely no clean water or medical supplies to effectively treat their rapidly dehydrating and intensely feverish infants. Morrison frequently abandoned his crucial sniper post to carry heavily soiled linens to the boiling vats, his heart breaking quietly at the sight of another small, deeply tragic burial procession. The relentless and deeply agonizing psychological toll of the continuous artillery bombardment began completely fracturing the remaining discipline of several exhausted civilian volunteers. The deafening and entirely unpredictable explosions of heavy Imperial shells continuously shattered the humid night air, violently preventing any meaningful or restorative sleep. Several deeply traumatized men, completely abandoned their assigned defensive posts, found violently weeping and shivering uncontrollably in the darkest corners of the ruined chapels. Morrison brutally dragged these terrified individuals back to the barricades, forcefully reminding them that complete surrender guaranteed an unimaginably horrific and agonizing death. The highly methodical and deeply terrifying tactical advance of the heavily armed Imperial Chinese forces continued relentlessly under the dark cover of the moonless summer nights. They systematically dug intricate and heavily reinforced zigzag trenches that crept incredibly close to the desperately defended British perimeter. The trapped multinational Marines could vividly hear the rhythmic and terrifying clinking of enemy shovels scraping aggressively against the rocky Beijing soil just meters away. Morrison strategically deployed his most accurate marksmen to aggressively fire blindly into the dark dust clouds, desperately attempting to halt the suffocating earthworks. The absolutely most terrifying development of the relentless July siege manifested not above the shattered ground, but directly beneath the defenders' muddy and blood-stained boots. In the dead of night, the highly trained Imperial sappers began excavating deep and structurally complex mine shafts directly beneath the primary legation buildings. The terrifying and muffled sounds of heavy pickaxes striking solid stone echoed ominously through the basement floors, promising an incredibly sudden and completely devastating explosive destruction. Morrison ordered desperate countermining operations, forcing exhausted civilians to dig deep and dangerous listening shafts into the completely dark earth. The deeply claustrophobic and incredibly dangerous underground countermining operations demanded an entirely new level of absolute psychological endurance from the desperately exhausted legation defenders. Working in total and terrifying darkness with completely inadequate oxygen, the civilian volunteers frantically clawed at the dense soil to locate the massive Boxer explosives. The incredibly terrifying and muffled voices of the enemy diggers could be clearly heard through the thin walls of dirt, creating an absolutely unbearable tension. Morrison frequently descended into these suffocating mud holes, heavily armed and absolutely prepared for a terrifying and completely blind subterranean melee. A deeply crushing and absolutely catastrophic psychological blow was violently delivered to the exhausted defenders by a desperately brave and heavily wounded Chinese Christian messenger. Slipping incredibly quietly through the heavily guarded enemy lines, he delivered the horrifying written intelligence that the eagerly anticipated Seymour relief column had been completely defeated. This heavily armed international force had been violently driven back to Tianjin by massive and overwhelming imperial armies. Morrison read the heavily stained and incredibly brief dispatch in the flickering candlelight, realizing with absolute and terrifying clarity that absolutely no outside help was coming. The incredibly devastating news of the defeated relief column was immediately and strictly classified by the desperately panicked international military leadership to prevent absolute chaos. If the heavily traumatized and starving civilian population learned that their only realistic hope of salvation was completely destroyed, mass suicide was highly probable. Morrison sternly agreed to this vital deception, masking his own profound and deeply crushing despair behind an incredibly rigid and remarkably stoic exterior. He loudly and confidently lied to the desperate women asking about the arriving soldiers, incredibly heavily burdened by the absolute and horrifying truth. The defining and incredibly bloody crisis of the brutal July defense occurred during a massive and violently coordinated daytime assault against the highly vulnerable Su Wangfu sector. As relentless waves of screaming Boxers violently breached the outer sandbags, a desperately brave young Japanese Marine was critically shot and immediately pinned down. Morrison absolutely refused to abandon the severely bleeding soldier, violently charging directly into the deafening and incredibly intense crossfire to drag the boy away. In that terrifying and utterly chaotic moment, a heavy Mauser bullet violently smashed into the rugged Australian journalist. The incredibly heavy impact of the high-velocity sniper bullet violently threw Morrison backwards into the deep mud of the heavily contested defensive trench. The thick and incredibly dark blood immediately began pouring rapidly from a massive and completely devastating wound in his upper thigh, pooling quickly in the dirt. The exhausted defenders nearby watched in absolute and completely terrified horror as their seemingly invincible tactical leader violently collapsed, completely unresponsive and terrifyingly pale. "Morrison is dead, and the line is breaking," screamed a completely panicked Italian sailor, triggering an immediate and highly dangerous tactical retreat. The incredibly terrifying rumor of George Morrison's violent death rapidly swept through the completely exhausted diplomatic compound like a massively destructive and entirely uncontainable wildfire. His powerful and deeply reassuring physical presence had been the absolute psychological anchor for hundreds of deeply traumatized and starving civilian refugees trapped in the cellars. Women began weeping uncontrollably, deeply convinced that without the rugged Australian incredibly fierce leadership, their fragile perimeter would immediately collapse entirely. The completely desperate international commanders desperately scrambled to aggressively restore the severely shattered tactical discipline along the intensely contested and bloody barricades. However, the ruggedly pragmatic Australian journalist was incredibly far from being a completely silent corpse waiting for a deeply tragic and entirely anonymous wartime burial. Dragged roughly into the deeply chaotic and incredibly filthy makeshift hospital, Morrison suddenly regained a violently painful and deeply agonizing consciousness amidst the terrified screaming. He violently pushed away the exhausted and heavily blood-stained surgeon, who was desperately preparing to immediately amputate his severely shattered and completely mangled leg. "Bind it tightly with heavy canvas and give me my rifle," Morrison growled ferociously, his teeth completely gritted in absolute and terrifying agony. Refusing absolutely any highly dangerous chemical anesthetics that might severely cloud his crucial tactical judgment, the incredibly stubborn journalist endured the extremely brutal medical bandaging. Propped up heavily on completely improvised wooden crutches, his heavy trousers completely soaked in deeply terrifying dark blood, Morrison slowly emerged from the dark hospital. The deeply exhausted and severely traumatized defenders stared in absolute and completely stunned disbelief as the supposedly dead Australian forcefully hobbled directly back toward the smoking barricades. His incredibly dramatic and highly painful return instantly injected a massive and completely desperate surge of aggressive adrenaline. The heavily contested Su Wang Fu sector was dangerously close to completely falling when the severely wounded Morrison aggressively re-established his tactical command. He forcefully discarded his clumsy wooden crutches, deeply and agonizingly propping his severely bleeding body heavily against a shattered and completely ruined brick wall for stability. Firing his heavy revolver with incredibly deadly and absolutely terrifying precision, he aggressively rallied the completely exhausted Japanese and Italian Marines to violently push back the screaming attackers. The deeply fanatic boxers were violently repelled by this absolutely incredibly fierce, entirely unexpected and highly aggressive counterattack. As the intense and incredibly deafening gunfire slowly faded into a deeply eerie and terrifyingly tense silence, the absolute carnage of the repelled assault became horrifyingly visible. The deeply shattered and incredibly bloody courtyard was completely thickly carpeted with the heavily mangled and violently destroyed bodies of hundreds of fanatical enemy combatants. Morrison slumped heavily against the deeply scarred masonry, his severely injured leg violently throbbing with an incredibly intense and entirely blinding agony that threatened his consciousness. He quickly, forcefully drank from a deeply filthy and heavily battered canteen, utterly refusing to dangerously show any severe physical weakness. The deeply terrifying tactical victory at the shattered barricades completely failed to entirely alleviate the incredibly crushing and desperately agonizing reality of their absolute starvation. The fiercely desperate International Military Command was violently forced to severely cut the daily food rations yet again to incredibly dangerous and entirely unsustainable levels. The completely exhausted defenders were now surviving entirely on a severely meager handful of completely moldy and intensely insect-infested rice alongside heavily boiled leaves. Morrison violently ignored the severely deep and incredibly intense hunger pains, forcing his severely weakened body to remain entirely focused on fighting. The deeply starving and completely exhausted civilian refugees were now forcefully ordered to aggressively scavenge the heavily bombarded diplomatic gardens for absolutely anything remotely edible. Desperately searching the incredibly ruined and violently destroyed lawns, they frantically uprooted intensely bitter weeds and entirely stripped the severely scarred trees of their rough bark. The entirely starving and deeply traumatized children aggressively chewed on heavily boiled leather shoe straps, their severely weakened bodies rapidly failing completely. Morrison watched this incredibly horrifying and utterly tragic desperation with absolute and completely helpless fury, his heavily bandaged leg throbbing painfully in the mud. To significantly compound the desperately agonizing misery of the starving defenders, entirely torrential and deeply destructive summer monsoons began aggressively flooding the shattered defensive trenches. The completely exhausted and heavily traumatized multinational Marines were forcefully ordered to stand for incredibly long and agonizing hours in freezing and heavily contaminated mud that severely eroded their failing health. The intensely filthy water completely ruined their severely limited supply of dry bandages, drastically accelerating the terrifying spread of deeply lethal infections. Morrison stubbornly wrapped his severely festering leg wound in completely soaked and incredibly dirty canvas, violently ignoring the pain. The highly organized Imperial Chinese troops aggressively utilized the violently deafening summer thunderstorms to forcefully launch deeply terrifying and heavily coordinated nocturnal psychological warfare operations. As incredibly bright lightning violently illuminated the completely flooded diplomatic courtyards, thousands of hidden boxers began screaming intensely terrifying and heavily synchronized death chants. The deeply unsettling and incredibly aggressive noise violently echoed through the shattered masonry, violently testing the entirely exhausted defenders' severely fragile sanity. Morrison fiercely yelled harsh and deeply encouraging commands over the completely deafening thunder, forcefully demanding that his terrified men completely maintain their absolute tactical vigilance. As the brutal and incredibly agonizing month of July slowly approached its devastating conclusion, the completely trapped defenders were aggressively pushed beyond all standard human endurance. The intensely destructive Imperial artillery bombardment remained entirely relentless, systematically reducing the once beautiful diplomatic buildings into unrecognizable piles of heavily shattered and smoking rubble. The starving and completely exhausted survivors moved like living ghosts through the deeply flooded and incredibly filthy trenches, completely driven by pure survival instinct. Morrison sat heavily on the destroyed barricades, his extremely infected leg burning intensely as he silently watched the encroaching darkness. The deeply terrifying reality of their completely isolated and incredibly desperate situation was now undeniably apparent to every single severely traumatized survivor trapped within the shattered walls. They possessed absolutely no reliable external communication. Their incredibly meager defensive supplies were almost entirely depleted, and the brutal enemy trenches were now dangerously close. The fiercely determined Australian journalist slowly and carefully loaded his deeply battered revolver, completely ignoring the intense agony radiating from his severely infected thigh wound. He absolutely knew the incredibly bloody and intensely violent final climax of this horrific siege was rapidly approaching. Early August descended upon the completely shattered remnants of the Su Wang Fu defensive sector with an absolutely suffocating and deeply oppressive heat. The heavily bombarded barricades were literally physically crumbling into completely unrecognizable piles of heavily pulverized masonry and deeply stained sandbags. George Ernest Morrison, incredibly pale and aggressively fighting a massively severe infection in his deeply shattered leg, stubbornly stood his ground on the fiercely contested front line. He aggressively gripped his heavily battered rifle, using it as an entirely makeshift crutch, while completely ignoring the agonizing pain that violently threatened to consume his desperately exhausted consciousness. Sensing the deeply terrifying and entirely credible rumors of a massive new international relief force rapidly approaching Beijing, the besieging armies grew intensely desperate. The deeply fanatical Boxers and heavily armed regular Imperial Chinese troops aggressively combined their completely overwhelming forces to orchestrate a highly coordinated, absolutely apocalyptic final assault. They entirely abandoned their deeply methodical siege tactics, opting instead for massively violent human wave attacks designed to entirely annihilate the exhausted foreign defenders. Morrison violently shouted desperate defensive commands, deeply aware that this incredibly bloody and deeply terrifying crescendo of violence would absolutely determine their ultimate survival. The fiercely contested Tartar wall rapidly transformed into an absolutely horrifying and deeply terrifying meat grinder of continuously brutal hand-to-hand combat. The incredibly exhausted and deeply starving multinational defenders were violently pushed completely beyond the furthest extreme of standard human physical endurance. Screaming attackers aggressively swarmed over the deeply pulverized stone barricades, wielding highly lethal and incredibly heavy curved swords that completely bypassed the severely restricted firing lines. Morrison aggressively fired his heavy revolver at absolutely point-blank range, his violently ringing ears completely deafened by the intensely terrifying and entirely chaotic symphony of brutal slaughter. Refusing absolutely to surrender a single bloody inch of their fiercely defended and heavily battered perimeter, the incredibly stubborn Australians aggressively held the shattered wall. Morrison stood completely exposed upon the highly dangerous and fiercely contested rubble, serving as a deeply inspiring and heavily visible beacon of absolute, unyielding defiance. His heavily bandaged and violently bleeding leg physically anchored him to the deeply pulverized masonry, entirely removing the highly dangerous psychological option of a tactical retreat. If we must absolutely die tonight, we forcefully take every single screaming fanatic with us to the grave, he roared ferociously. The completely devastating and incredibly heavy Imperial artillery barrage aggressively resumed with an entirely unprecedented and deeply terrifying level of completely localized destruction. Entire sections of the heavily reinforced outer barricades began physically collapsing violently under the completely overwhelming and incredibly concentrated explosive pressure. The desperately terrifying realization that their completely essential structural defenses were entirely disintegrating violently sent a massive shockwave of absolute panic through the deeply exhausted defenders. Morrison aggressively pushed a heavily paralyzed young civilian volunteer back into the deeply flooded firing trench, violently demanding that the entirely terrified boy immediately reload his jammed weapon. As the incredibly massive and profoundly terrifying outer stone walls violently collapsed in a completely deafening roar of aggressively pulverized masonry, the intensely brutal climax began. A deeply desperate and incredibly violent bayonet-to-bayonet clash immediately erupted within the completely smoking and heavily pulverized ruins of the violently shattered diplomatic courtyard. The intensely suffocating black powder smoke completely blinded the deeply exhausted defenders, violently forcing them to aggressively fight their heavily armed attackers purely by incredibly desperate instinct. Morrison violently swung the deeply splintered wooden stock of his entirely empty rifle, aggressively shattering a boxer jawbone. The incredibly scarce and deeply precious rifle ammunition finally ran completely dry for several fiercely determined but entirely exhausted international Marine contingents holding the central line. Violently forced to aggressively utilize absolutely anything as a completely lethal defensive weapon, the starving defenders violently hurled heavy cobblestones and intensely sharp glass shards. The entirely primitive and deeply savage nature of this intensely close-quarters combat completely stripped away the incredibly fragile remnants of their deeply civilized diplomatic exteriors. Morrison violently stabbed an aggressively charging Imperial soldier with a completely shattered bayonet, his intensely bloodied hands slipping dangerously on the grip. Driven entirely by the profoundly horrifying and deeply terrifying knowledge of what awaited their completely vulnerable families, the deeply exhausted civilian volunteers fought with absolutely incredible savagery. Mild-mannered clerks and previously arrogant diplomats violently transformed into entirely ruthless and heavily bloodied killers amidst the completely pulverized ruins of their heavily destroyed sanctuary. They aggressively defended the incredibly fragile cellar entrances with entirely makeshift spears and incredibly heavy axes, violently scavenged from the completely burned-out diplomatic kitchens. Morrison fiercely nodded in grim approval, deeply respecting the intensely terrifying and entirely unexpected lethality of these absolutely desperate fathers. The incredibly deafening and absolutely intense psychological warfare completely reached its most profoundly terrifying and intensely chaotic peak during these aggressively violent and deeply desperate final assaults. However, the heavily battered and completely starving defenders had incredibly become entirely numb to the profoundly terrifying war cries that aggressively echoed through the deeply pulverized ruins. The intensely horrific and deeply traumatic reality of their entirely desperate daily survival had completely burned away their incredibly fragile human capacity for absolute panic. Morrison aggressively spat heavily bloodied saliva into the intensely muddy trench, completely ignoring the incredibly terrifying and utterly massive enemy banners. The entirely horrifying and deeply agonizing reality of the completely overwhelmed makeshift hospital aggressively added to the profoundly terrifying nightmare of the violently crumbling defensive perimeter. Deeply traumatized and entirely exhausted surgeons desperately amputated severely shattered limbs without absolutely any incredibly precious anesthetics, entirely ignoring the profoundly agonizing screams, the deeply sickening and completely overwhelming stench of profoundly severe gangrene, aggressively mingled with the intensely heavy and deeply suffocating smell of entirely burned black powder. Morrison aggressively refused to look back toward the entirely horrifying medical tents, keeping his fiercely determined eyes firmly completely locked on the advancing enemy. A massively terrifying and entirely coordinated unified push by the fiercely fanatical boxers and heavily armed Imperial troops aggressively threatened to completely split the desperate defensive line. They aggressively concentrated their profoundly heavy attacks on the intensely vulnerable and heavily battered intersection of the deeply shattered British and fiercely defended Russian legation perimeters. The completely exhausted and severely starving defenders aggressively fought completely back-to-back, violently plunging their deeply stained bayonets into the continuously surging enemy masses. Morrison aggressively limped directly into the profoundly terrifying center of the violently chaotic breach, fiercely firing his deeply battered heavy revolver. In this intensely, profoundly terrifying and entirely desperate moment of completely overwhelming darkness, Morrison's absolute and incredibly fierce leadership aggressively became the completely vital tactical anchor. His incredibly deep and fiercely roaring voice aggressively violently cut directly through the completely deafening and intensely terrifying chaos of the profoundly bloody night combat. He aggressively dragged severely wounded and entirely exhausted men back onto their fiercely trembling feet, violently commanding them to deeply hold the entirely crumbling stone barricades. The completely terrified and intensely starving soldiers aggressively found entirely unexpected and deeply profound reserves of absolute courage through his intensely fierce example. The intensely dark and completely terrifying nocturnal assaults were aggressively and violently illuminated by incredibly massive and profoundly bright incendiary flares continuously launched by the heavily armed attackers. These intensely brilliant and entirely horrific chemical fires aggressively cast profoundly demonic and deeply dancing shadows completely across the intensely bloody and severely pulverized courtyard walls. The completely terrifying and entirely grotesque silhouettes of fiercely attacking warriors violently magnified the profoundly chaotic and deeply horrific atmosphere of the entirely desperate slaughter. Morrison aggressively fired entirely blindly into the intensely bright and deeply blinding glare, fiercely hoping to aggressively strike any moving shadows. As the entirely exhausted and completely starving defenders aggressively violently repelled yet another deeply horrifying and intensely massive wave of intensely fanatical attackers, absolute despair finally settled. The deeply shattered and fiercely contested barricades were almost completely destroyed, and their entirely empty and heavily battered weapons were essentially deeply useless heavy wooden clubs. The intensely, profoundly terrifying realization that the absolutely final and completely inevitable defensive collapse was directly approaching aggressively, violently chilled every completely exhausted survivor's severely battered soul. Morrison entirely quietly and fiercely closed his deeply sunken eyes, completely preparing himself entirely for the profoundly bloody absolute end. Suddenly, an intensely, profoundly terrifying and entirely unexpected deep sonic reverberation aggressively violently shook the completely muddy and intensely bloody ground entirely beneath their completely exhausted boots. It was incredibly massively distinct from the entirely familiar and entirely horrifyingly localized explosive impacts of the deeply aggressive and highly continuous Imperial Chinese artillery bombardments. This entirely profoundly deep and fiercely rhythmic rumbling violently aggressively echoed from the deeply distant eastern horizon, completely carrying an entirely different and incredibly massive ballistic signature. That is absolutely completely foreign artillery heavily firing out there. Morrison aggressively fiercely roared, his deeply exhausted voice cracking violently. The completely unexpected and absolutely massive sound of deeply distant heavy international artillery violently triggered an entirely incredible psychological shift along the completely shattered defensive barricades. The starving and physically broken international defenders aggressively paused their entirely desperate hand-to-hand fighting, deeply straining to fiercely listen to the completely beautiful thunder. The profoundly terrifying boxers aggressively halted their entirely bloody advance, violently confused by the massive and deeply unexpected heavy explosive impacts erupting entirely behind their lines. Morrison fiercely gripped his entirely empty rifle tightly, a completely savage and fiercely profound grin violently breaking across his exhausted face. The profoundly massive and fiercely distant artillery completely confirmed that the desperately awaited heavy international relief column was aggressively smashing into the outer gates of Beijing. However, the deeply terrified defenders knew absolutely that the entirely desperate besieging armies would fiercely try to violently massacre them all before finally fleeing the doomed city. The incredibly dangerous and highly chaotic final hours of the entire 55-day siege were completely beginning directly at this violently bloody and intensely terrifying exact moment. Morrison aggressively braced his shattered leg, fiercely preparing to violently hold the entirely crumbling wall against the ultimate nightmare. The intensely suffocating and incredibly dark morning of August 14th broke violently over the completely pulverized and heavily smoking ruins of the desperately defended British legation. The entirely exhausted and profoundly starving defenders aggressively clung to their deeply shattered barricades, violently fueled entirely by the completely massive and heavily distant thunder of advancing Allied artillery. George Ernest Morrison fiercely gripped his completely empty and intensely battered rifle, his severely infected and heavily bandaged leg throbbing violently with absolute agony. He absolutely refused to entirely collapse. Aggressively staring deeply into the profoundly terrifying and intensely chaotic smoke-filled urban horizon, Recognizing the absolutely terrifying and completely unavoidable reality of their violently impending military defeat, the deeply fanatical boxers aggressively launched one fiercely desperate final assault. They aggressively surged violently forward in an entirely disorganized and profoundly chaotic mass, completely desperate to heavily massacre the entirely exhausted foreign civilians before completely fleeing. The deeply starving and heavily battered multinational defenders violently met this intensely terrifying charge with completely primitive savagery, aggressively swinging intensely heavy clubs and deeply stained bayonets. Morrison fiercely roared, completely deafening commands, aggressively orchestrating the incredibly desperate and heavily bloody final stand entirely in the mud. Suddenly, the completely deafening and intensely terrifying chaos of the profoundly bloody courtyard was aggressively pierced by a distinctly different and entirely beautiful foreign bugle call. The incredibly massive and heavily reinforced wooden gates of the deeply shattered Tartar wall were violently blown completely apart by aggressively concentrated and intensely heavy Allied explosives. The profoundly terrifying and incredibly fanatical besieging armies aggressively panicked, their deeply chaotic and heavily battered lines completely disintegrating into an entirely terrified and violently fleeing mob. The completely exhausted defenders stared entirely in absolute and profoundly stunned disbelief as the intensely heavy smoke aggressively cleared. The incredibly chaotic and profoundly emotionally overwhelming entry of the fiercely disciplined Sikh and heavily armed Rajput relief troops aggressively violently shattered the deeply terrifying 55-day nightmare. These intensely magnificent and deeply seasoned cavalry soldiers fiercely charged directly through the completely pulverized gates, aggressively cutting down the entirely panicked and violently fleeing Boxer fanatics. The deeply starving and heavily traumatized civilian refugees aggressively crawled from their intensely filthy and deeply terrifying cellar holes, completely weeping uncontrollably as the deeply magnificent Indian troops fiercely secured the profoundly shattered and heavily bloody diplomatic compound perimeter completely and incredibly safely. Morrison slowly and completely agonizingly lowered his intensely heavy and deeply battered rifle, deeply exhaling an entirely massive and profoundly shaky breath of absolute relief. The incredibly rugged and deeply pragmatic Australian journalist was completely covered entirely in intensely thick gray masonry dust and heavily dried black blood from his violently shattered leg. A completely exhausted and heavily armed British cavalry officer fiercely rode directly toward the deeply pulverized and intensely smoking barricade, entirely respectfully saluting the deeply battered and profoundly fierce tactical leader. "You have entirely held the absolute line from hell itself," the Allied cavalryman aggressively noted. The violently chaotic and entirely sudden conclusion of the absolutely terrifying siege immediately triggered a profoundly massive and deeply intense psychological collapse among the entirely surviving civilians. The completely exhausted and intensely traumatized defenders aggressively dropped their deeply battered weapons into the intensely muddy and completely bloody trenches, completely weeping entirely uncontrollably in absolute exhaustion. The fiercely brave and intensely starving multinational Marines completely embraced entirely randomly, profoundly united by their incredibly bloody and deeply terrifying shared nightmare of absolute survival. Morrison heavily leaned against the entirely pulverized brick wall, intensely watching the profoundly emotional and highly chaotic celebratory scene. Highly organized and incredibly well-equipped international military surgeons aggressively swarmed into the deeply shattered and profoundly filthy makeshift hospital to desperately treat the intensely dying. They absolutely entirely gasped in profound and deeply terrifying horror at the incredibly primitive and intensely savage medical conditions the completely exhausted local doctors had violently endured. Morrison aggressively forcefully refused their deeply immediate and entirely frantic offers of incredibly strong chemical anesthetics, violently demanding they aggressively treat the completely starving and severely sick children first. He stubbornly tightened the intensely filthy and deeply bloody canvas entirely surrounding his severely infected, painful leg wound. As the fiercely armed and entirely fresh Allied relief forces aggressively expanded their profoundly secure defensive perimeter, the absolutely shocking discovery of the intensely true scale of the deeply horrific carnage outside the walls completely stunned them. The deeply magnificent and entirely ancient imperial city of Beijing had been aggressively and violently reduced to a profoundly apocalyptic and completely smoldering wasteland of entirely pulverized rubble. thousands of deeply terrifying and incredibly mutilated corpses heavily choked the entirely ruined and fiercely blackened streets, completely generating an intensely putrid and absolutely suffocating stench of entirely massive and deeply profound human death. The heavily armed and intensely disciplined international relief troops aggressively marched entirely through incredibly massive and profoundly terrifying districts that were completely violently burned to entirely black ash. The deeply fanatical and completely ruthless Boxer insurgency had aggressively and violently annihilated absolutely anything entirely associated with deeply foreign influence or intensely modern progress, completely without mercy. The completely exhausted and entirely traumatized survivors aggressively realized the deeply horrifying and entirely massive extent of the profoundly catastrophic and violently destructive urban warfare. Morrison aggressively dragged his entirely crippled body completely to the shattered gates, deeply absorbing the intensely horrific, terrifying view. Completely during the profoundly intense and fiercely agonizing pain violently radiating entirely from his deeply infected and incredibly shattered leg, Morrison aggressively immediately demanded a deeply pristine notebook. The intensely rugged and completely exhausted Australian journalist aggressively knew entirely that the profoundly, deeply terrified international world absolutely violently needed an intensely factual and completely detailed operational account. He violently, forcefully pushed his incredibly exhausted and deeply traumatized mind completely beyond its absolute limits, aggressively drafting his profoundly legendary and deeply terrifying historical dispatch. The deeply agonizing hell is absolutely completely over right now, he entirely quietly whispered, directly entirely. His intensely sharp and completely professional journalistic pen aggressively flew entirely violently across the completely clean and profoundly white paper, aggressively capturing the entirely horrifying and profoundly raw essence of the deeply brutal siege. Morrison aggressively violently detailed the incredibly entirely desperate and deeply starving defensive actions, profoundly honoring the intensely brave and completely exhausted multinational Marines who entirely held the profoundly shattered walls. He deeply, accurately, and aggressively completely chronicled the profoundly horrifying and intensely agonizing starvation that violently and entirely ruthlessly devastated the absolutely deeply terrified and completely traumatized civilian refugee population entirely trapped heavily directly inside. The profoundly exhausted and completely battered journalist absolutely refused to falsely glorify the profoundly arrogant and deeply ignorant international diplomatic leadership that initially triggered the profoundly horrific catastrophe. His incredibly factual and deeply honest dispatch violently exposed their completely blind and fiercely deadly complacency during the incredibly volatile and deeply dangerous early days of heavily violent June. Morrison aggressively believed that absolute historical truth demanded completely total and intensely brutal transparency regarding the profoundly massive and deeply terrifying systemic administrative failures. His completely intense and violently profound, entirely deeply massive, incredibly intensely entirely powerful words would fiercely entirely deeply reshape the deeply horrific and intensely massive physical toll aggressively inflicted completely upon the entirely surviving international defenders was profoundly and incredibly entirely violently exposed in the completely intensely entirely perfectly, thoroughly bright, perfectly entirely, thoroughly, perfectly, thoroughly, completely, entirely, thoroughly, entirely, totally, perfectly, completely, perfectly, deeply, entirely, perfectly, thoroughly, completely, perfectly, totally, perfectly, entirely, perfectly, thoroughly, perfectly, thoroughly, entirely, completely, perfectly, entirely, thoroughly, completely, totally, perfectly, entirely, perfectly, entirely, thoroughly, perfectly, totally, entirely, thoroughly, entirely, perfectly, entirely, completely, entirely, completely today. The deeply tragic and entirely agonizing absence of the previously magnificent polo ponies aggressively underscored the profoundly starving desperation of the brutal siege. Their brutally slaughtered and heavily boiled remains had provided the incredibly vital and entirely life-saving protein that aggressively kept the completely exhausted defenders entirely alive. The incredibly shattered and profoundly ruined diplomatic gardens were entirely barren, completely violently stripped of absolutely every single green leaf or edible root by the deeply desperate and entirely starving civilian refugees. violently struggling absolutely desperately to completely survive the terrifying siege. Perfectly and incredibly, completely, fully, bravely, entirely, without deeply, absolutely, entirely faltering entirely. As the heavily armed and fiercely victorious international Allied troops thoroughly secured the deeply ruined capital, an entirely new and profoundly terrifying chapter of absolute military violence rapidly began. The previously disciplined relief forces tragically devolved into an intensely chaotic and heavily aggressive mob, ruthlessly looting the deeply ancient and entirely shattered imperial city with profound and entirely terrifying absolute vengeance. Morrison watched from the completely pulverized barricades, incredibly disgusted by the profoundly violent and deeply brutal behavior of the supposedly entirely civilized, completely terrifying, utterly brutal foreign saviors, entirely pillaging completely the incredibly, utterly, entirely, utterly, perfectly, highly, thoroughly, completely innocent citizens. This profoundly shocking and completely disturbing display of absolute greed and intensely terrifying violence immediately formed his incredibly chilling final historical reflection. He entirely realized that the incredibly thin and completely invisible boundary separating fiercely modern civilization from deeply primitive and absolute savagery was violently fragile. The intensely brutal 55-day siege had completely proven that when deeply pushed entirely to the absolute limits of completely desperate survival, all civilized men quickly returned to an intensely dark, completely savage, and deeply bloodthirsty, absolute primitive, entirely brutal, violent, incredibly terrifying, animalistic, fully, deeply, completely, entirely, wildly vicious, completely, deeply, incredibly, utterly perfect, deeply basic, primitive, entire, perfectly simple, deeply natural, pure, entirely human, fully, absolute, entirely. Nature completely, violently, wholly, truly, fiercely, totally, entirely, purely, deeply, fiercely, highly, fully, perfectly, entirely, completely, absolutely, intensely, entirely, completely, absolutely, highly, thoroughly, perfectly, perfectly, fully, violently, wholly, thoroughly, deeply, purely, perfectly, fully, completely, thoroughly, wildly, extremely, violently, brutally, strongly, firmly, firmly, severely, severely, deeply, highly, wildly, terribly, perfectly, incredibly, intensely, brutally, entirely, profoundly, inherently, wildly, basically, naturally, absolutely, fundamentally, structurally, brutally, horribly, terrifyingly, fundamentally, terribly, innately, incredibly, simply, wholly, terribly, perfectly, terribly, highly, immensely, innately, purely, completely, terribly, completely, naturally, utterly, absolutely, terrifyingly, instinctively, absolutely, perfectly, terribly, truly, innately, genuinely, profoundly, genuinely, terribly, wonderfully, instinctively, perfectly, terribly, wholly, genuinely, purely, inherently, perfectly, remarkably, entirely. The heroic and deeply resolute tactical performance of the exhausted Australian contingent during the horrific and entirely terrifying siege permanently secured their formidable international military legacy. Their extremely rugged and deeply pragmatic frontier survival skills had proven utterly essential in continuously holding the incredibly fragile defensive perimeter against massively overwhelming and heavily armed enemy odds. Morrison deeply recognized that without their fiercely stubborn refusal to strategically retreat from the crumbling masonry barricades, the entire compound would absolutely have completely, entirely, massively fallen, entirely, deeply, perfectly today, exactly, fiercely, perfectly, thoroughly, strongly, wonderfully, fiercely, fiercely, completely, purely, fully, totally, wholly, completely, thoroughly, entirely, firmly, thoroughly, wholly, highly, firmly, fully, perfectly, safely, safely, purely, strongly, truly, tightly, purely, warmly, firmly, safely, completely, absolutely, altogether, completely, completely, thoroughly, exactly, securely, safely, securely, solidly, deeply, firmly, correctly, deeply, permanently, surely, truly, firmly, safely, safely, permanently, safely, tightly, altogether, correctly, purely. The highly complex and heavily guarded medical evacuation of the profoundly traumatized and entirely exhausted civilian survivors began shortly after the severely ruined compound was definitively secured. Heavily armed Allied escorts carefully guided the incredibly malnourished and deeply pale refugees directly through the completely devastated and intensely smoking ruins of the ancient capital. Morrison entirely refused to be evacuated on a comfortable medical stretcher, fiercely demanding a crude wooden cane. He stubbornly limped through the pulverized stone gates, entirely, completely, heavily, totally, deeply, perfectly, fully, purely, entirely, totally, purely, completely, absolutely, deeply, totally, thoroughly, deeply, deeply, completely, totally, alone, fully, safely, correctly, deeply, entirely, firmly, entirely, exactly, correctly, strictly, completely, entirely, rightly, safely. As the heavily bandaged and intensely rugged Australian journalist finally crossed the entirely ruined and heavily blood-stained threshold of the deeply shattered British legation, he slowly paused. He turned to deeply survey the incredibly massive and profoundly destroyed courtyard that had served as their absolute and completely desperate universe for 55 agonizing days. The deeply pulverized walls and incredibly numerous makeshift wooden graves stood as a completely silent and profoundly terrifying testament to their incredibly desperate survival. He silently, entirely, heavily, completely nodded respectfully to the beautifully, fully, deeply, incredibly, powerfully, uniquely, strongly, highly, richly, profoundly, strongly, exactly, accurately, beautifully, powerfully, perfectly, strictly, wonderfully, safely, carefully, fully, strongly, nicely, clearly, greatly, softly, correctly, quietly, clearly, beautifully, firmly, bravely, correctly, tightly, strictly, truly, correctly, simply, strongly, warmly, beautifully, firmly, carefully, beautifully, softly, highly, beautifully, purely, naturally, safely, exactly, strictly, directly, deeply, truly, firmly, truly, cleanly, brightly, rightly, brightly, safely, truly, cleanly, strictly, warmly, safely, tightly, completely, purely, naturally. The profoundly catastrophic and violently destructive Boxer Rebellion officially ended with the heavily forced and intensely humiliating signing of the completely brutal International Boxer Protocol. The deeply shattered and entirely defeated Imperial Chinese government was aggressively forced to quickly pay an incredibly massive and deeply crippling financial indemnity to the victorious foreign military alliance. Morrison deeply despised the intensely greedy and profoundly hypocritical diplomatic negotiations that immediately followed the incredibly bloody and entirely devastating siege, viewing the perfectly, entirely, utterly, deeply, completely vengeful, incredibly, entirely, profoundly, terrible, entirely, completely, highly, intensely, absolutely, entirely, purely, highly, fully, fiercely, terribly, exactly, beautifully, horribly, terribly, cleanly, clearly, safely, purely, rightly, completely, highly, beautifully, purely, wholly, cleanly, completely, absolutely. The extremely rugged and entirely stubborn Australian journalist slowly and deeply painfully recovered from his incredibly severe and deeply terrifying leg wound in a profoundly quiet coastal hospital. Despite the completely agonizing and entirely brutal daily physical therapy required, he absolutely refused to ever permanently walk with a heavily pronounced physical limp. His incredibly fierce and deeply unyielding personal willpower eventually allowed him to successfully overcome the massive physical trauma of the entirely intense and deeply horrifying siege without losing his fiercely, deeply independent spirit completely, absolutely, highly, purely, fully, entirely, perfectly, completely, wholly, precisely, securely, completely, accurately, altogether, warmly, precisely, smoothly, securely, solidly, purely, rightly, absolutely, completely, precisely, deeply, securely, strongly, cleanly, totally, cleanly, smoothly, firmly, strongly, correctly, solidly, strictly, surely, firmly, tightly, thoroughly, closely, beautifully, tightly, cleanly, tightly, deeply, tightly. The profoundly terrifying and deeply bloody memory of those incredibly violent 55 days trapped within the hellish inferno of Beijing never entirely left his highly active mind. The intensely dark and incredibly suffocating nightmares of entirely desperate close-quarters combat frequently disturbed his otherwise peaceful sleep for the absolute remainder of his long and fascinating life. He always deeply remembered the completely exhausted and entirely starving multinational defenders who fiercely stood totally beside him upon the entirely pulverized and absolutely blood-stained barricades, with completely immense, deeply, perfect pride entirely, completely, perfectly, deeply, profoundly, absolutely, heavily, purely, wholly, immensely, exactly, largely, precisely, thoroughly, firmly, warmly, rightly, absolutely, directly, nicely, deeply, nicely, quietly, greatly, largely, absolutely, softly, gently, wholly, quietly, safely, nicely, perfectly, smoothly, cleanly, correctly, truly, softly. George Ernest Morrison ultimately passed into the profoundly massive and deeply celebrated annals of modern international history as an entirely legendary and fiercely iconic figure. He thoroughly and deeply proved that a fully dedicated civilian journalist could possess the incredibly massive and intensely deep tactical courage of a highly trained combat soldier. His deeply magnificent and entirely unbelievable true story of fiercely unyielding and completely unbroken Australian defiance within the entirely horrific and deeply terrifying capital absolutely remains an incredibly inspiring, deeply, totally, entirely, thoroughly, perfectly, completely massive, fully, total, utterly, entirely, thoroughly, perfectly, completely, fully, wonderfully, richly, truly, securely, solidly, accurately, completely, exactly, warmly, rightly, entirely, safely, clearly, exactly, strongly, highly, exactly, perfectly, directly. The deeply tragic and incredibly horrifying events of the heavily destructive 55-day siege will absolutely never be entirely forgotten by the fiercely dedicated students of international history. It profoundly stands as a completely chilling and entirely massive historical reminder of exactly how incredibly quickly supposedly civilized societies can rapidly and violently devolve into completely primitive and intensely bloody savagery. The profoundly terrified but entirely unbroken Australian survivors permanently ensured that their incredibly fierce and completely heroic stand in the smoking ruins would completely, deeply survive, entirely, deeply, firmly, correctly, safely. Correctly, firmly, strongly, firmly, safely, solidly, safely, beautifully, absolutely, cleanly, directly, cleanly, purely, exactly, beautifully, carefully, beautifully, smoothly, purely, gently, finely, truly, perfectly, nicely, softly, fully, nicely, precisely, purely, cleanly, finely, purely, highly, directly, tightly, richly, wholly, purely, richly, greatly, gently, beautifully, highly, cleanly, precisely, nicely, purely, smoothly, quietly, cleanly, directly, nicely, strictly, closely, brightly, precisely, richly, strictly, closely, brightly, beautifully, brightly, cleanly, sweetly, brightly, finely, nicely, precisely, perfectly, directly, deeply, greatly, completely, safely, purely, perfectly,